So at 8:30, I also told them this, but just by quick show of hands, how many of you have seen the movie Moana? Yes, a lot of people. For this Sunday, I was very tempted to sing the full 3 minutes of Shiny from Moana, but I decided to spare all of you that this morning. But have you ever experienced a moment so profound that it left you changed? Maybe it was a conversation, a place, or an encounter with a person that maybe changed your perspective in a way that you never anticipated. Now, imagine, if you've had those moments before, what it would be like to stand in the very presence of God, to witness God's glory so powerfully that it transforms you. For me, I've had a couple moments in my life like this. The first one was an ordination service at annual conference when I was 15, 14, something around there. And the bishop, like all bishops do, spoke at annual conference and gave a powerful sermon that most bishops give, which is something like, ordinands, good luck. You're going to need it. And then also for those in the congregation witnessing this, it's a call to both new clergy, old clergy, and regular congregants that it's a call to fulfill that which God is asking us to do. And there's something about that moment that stopped me in my tracks, that kind of urged me that when the bishop, as they always do, invite people experiencing a call to ministry to come forward, something about that moment grabbed my attention so much that before I knew it, I was down at the front of the church. And they're asking me my name, age, phone number, all those things. And they do keep track of that, by the way. They will send you emails. But the reason that changed my life is because from that point on, whenever I thought about doing other things, and I've thought about many different career paths. When I was a kid, I was going to be an architect, and if that didn't work out, I was going to be president. That was the backup plan. And then I go to college, and I'm like, okay, well, I'm going to be a high school band director, and that changed. And the reason I was changed is because from that point on, whenever I thought about doing anything else, I just couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more that I could be doing, or something different, or finding ways to hopefully make an impact on the world in a profound way. And so this is that same thing, except on a much larger degree, happens to Moses in this passage. He doesn't just receive commandments or guidance, he actually experiences God's presence in a way that marks him forever. And before we get to the passage, we have to kind of understand some of the context. So Moses, before this, has already come down from the mountain once with commandments, and Moses comes back to find out that while he was gone, the people of Israel were worshiping a golden calf. And Moses is so angry that he actually throws the first ones on the ground, and it never actually tells us what was on those, but on the ground, broken. And he's kind of like, now, look what you made me do. Now I got to go back up to the mountain and go get more. So that's what he does. But yet, after God's people are literally worshiping a golden calf instead of God, God still chooses to be amongst God's people. This passage isn't just about Moses. It's about God's desire to be with God's people, even in their brokenness. And it's also about us. Because if Moses, an ordinary man with flaws, failures, shortcomings, could carry the presence of God, then perhaps we too can carry God's presence. And so this passage today We already talked about their worshiping the golden calf before this. Moses goes up to the mountain to get more commandments. And between those 2 points, the author of Exodus stops and tells us about the meeting tent, where Moses would literally go to talk to God, and it's described as a cloud of God's glory would descend on the tent, and the people of Israel would be like, okay, Moses is talking to God. And so the author of Exodus spends a lot of time talking about God's presence, whether it is Moses meeting with God, God being this cloud, and then the passage after this one today, they spend time talking about the tabernacle, which will be the temple, the final resting place, is what Israel thought of God's presence. So this theme of God's presence continues in this book, and I could imagine for a people that just left Egypt and were promised to trust the God of their ancestors, this idea that God has not left them, I'm sure, is comforting. And I could also imagine that there's maybe some fear as well, that God's presence could potentially leave them. So it's this tension between the two. And fascinating enough, God throughout the Bible is depicted in different ways. So in Genesis, we see God portrayed as having a body and talking and walking with Adam, Eve, Abraham, even wrestling with Jacob. So God has a physical body that people can see. And then all of a sudden in Exodus, you see this shift of God is described as speaking to Moses in a burning bush and a whisper and this cloud that falls upon the tent. And so God is portrayed in Exodus as otherworldly or out there or not this person that can interact with them. And so depending on who wrote these books, their perception of God changes just because, we all have different beliefs about who God is and how God acts. And so you see that shift really happen because a lot of scholars believe that it's priests writing Exodus, and they care about God's presence, God being divine, separated from us as people. And then you also see them spend a lot of time on the tabernacle, supposed to be X feet wide, X feet long, and made out of this, and they spend all these meticulous details on what the temple ultimately should be, things priests care about. And so through this difference, Moses has an experience that no other human has had since Genesis up till this point. No one else has seen God moving amongst them. And in the passage before this one, Moses is actually allowed to see just a glimpse of God's presence, because more than that would be too much, is what God tells Moses. Moses is granted a mostly unfiltered access to the divine. And for the first time in a long time, humanity meets divinity in a very powerful way. And Moses acts as a mediator between God and the world, being the vehicle, the vessel, the person that God's very presence moves from Mount Sinai to the eventual tabernacle that will get built. And most people on Transfiguration Sunday preach on Jesus' transfiguration in the Gospels. But when I saw the lectionary, I said, let me talk about Moses. That isn't often preached on this Sunday. Because to me, we all know that Jesus, Son of God, the fancy word or the fancy idea is that God is fully human. Not God. Jesus is fully divine, fully human. And so when Jesus lights up and is transfigured, it's almost like I'm kind of expecting that to happen, The people back then didn't, but like me reading the stories, I'm like, okay, well, Jesus does a lot of crazy things, so I almost expect that. But Moses, Moses, who's 100% human, not divine at all in any way, shape, or form. Moses is the one whose face lights up in this supernatural way. That's what makes the veil that Moses places on his face so interesting. And there's two different train of thoughts. One is that the veil is protecting God from us. Almost as if if God interacts with us too much, then God will not be as godlike. Hence why you see the cloud and all these other things. But the other belief or thought or way to look at this is that it's actually protecting us from God, or trying to almost act as a filtered way for us to look at God, which Moses has that experience. God tells him, you can't see all of me, or else that's going to be too much. And I also like that interpretation and lean on that one of us being at least semi-protected from the divine, or not being able to understand or comprehend or accept the divine fully. Because throughout the Bible, God is with us and among us and working for us in the sense of like looking after our interests. And so if that's the case, if God's supposed to be protected from us, that just doesn't line up to me. God is with and for us and invites us along the journey. And perhaps my favorite part about the passage is the Israelites' reaction to Moses' face. They're afraid of the unknown. They're afraid of God's presence and what it might mean for them. How many times have we been afraid to approach God because we were unsure what we might be asked to do? Or maybe we've been afraid to approach God because our flaws are magnified. Whenever I approach God, I realize that I am 100% not God, and that's a little scary. How can someone so ordinary like me approach the divine creator of the universe? Friends, if Moses, a complete human, not divine at all, can become a channel of God's presence so greatly that his face shines, then perhaps we can also be carriers of God's presence to others. We encounter God's grace through ordinary means, and I would argue that God delights to work in the ordinary. God delights to work with us so that way God's glory can be made that much stronger. And we're going to partake of communion in a second, and there's different thoughts about communion. Some say that it is the actual body and blood of Christ. Other people say we just kind of do it to remember and there's not anything crazy happening, but we as United Methodists believe somewhere in the middle. We believe that in the ordinary bread and cup and an ordinary person, pastor, that God shows up in the midst of that and meets us yet again in the ordinary. And in the ordinary, God makes the ordinary extraordinary. God takes broken people, hesitant hearts, fearful minds, and fills them with divine presence so that way God's glory can be seen in the world. If Moses can carry God's presence and help lead others to transformation, then so can we. The world is full of darkness, injustice, brokenness, but instead of working alone, God invites us to partner with God, to work to heal, restore, and bring hope. God partners with us through our prayers, our hands, our voices, and our willingness to simply say, "Here I am." So what would it look like if we truly embrace God's presence in our lives? Is our face shining? Is there something about us that we get to bring the presence of God to other people? Friends, God is still at work. God is still calling people, ordinary people, into an extraordinary partnership with God. The real question is, will we step into God's presence and say yes? May it be so. Amen.